They will tell you it was an accident, that it was grief, misfortune, coincidence. They will not tell you what Dr. Samuel Harding wrote in his private journals, words so unsettling the county sealed them for over a century. They will not tell you what the animals knew before the people did, or why in the summer of 1867 the air in Sedalia, Missouri seemed to grow heavier when an 8-year-old boy walked past. You're about to hear the truth of Timothy Caldwell, but you need to understand, once you know it, you cannot unknow it. You cannot go back to believing evil has an age. The first thing they noticed wasn't violence, it was focus. A child who never tired, who worked from sunrise to sunset without play, without pause, without joy. His neighbors said he was a little machine. His uncle said he was a blessing, but machines are built for function, and some functions are not meant for daylight. Dr. Harding met the boy in June of 1866 at the general store. He'd treated war-wounded men, held dying soldiers in his arms, and looked into the eyes of killers. Something in Timothy's gaze matched that last category. It wasn't fear, it wasn't shyness, it was study. As if the child was measuring him, cataloguing him, the way a hunter studies the movement of prey. Sedalia was still raw from the Civil War. The ground was soft with the bones of young men. Farms struggled to restart, and every neighbor watched every other neighbor just to keep things alive. But even in a community that knew death, what followed in the next months felt wrong. First, Mary Fletcher, 5 years old. Bright laugh, wandering spirit. Found face down in 18 inches of water at Willow Creek. Timothy was the one who came to the Fletcher door, his voice steady. "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." He gave precise details of her position, the branch that caught her dress, the shade of the way at her around her face, details a child shouldn't notice in shock, details a physician like Harding couldn't ignore. Then, Henrik Lenn, the old logger who knew Devil's Bluff like the veins on his hand. Found broken at the bottom, bees scattered like confetti around his corpse. Timothy spotted his hat on a thorn bush. He suggested perhaps the bees swarmed. He panicked and fell. But Harding climbed to the hive, undisturbed, calm, unagitated, which left the doctor to wonder, how does a man fall without stumbling first? And then, Jacob Mills, 6 years old, missing for 4 days, found in an abandoned well, hidden beneath carefully arranged debris no one should have stumbled upon unless they knew it was there. Timothy found him, alive, just long enough to die in front of Harding, and the boy didn't grieve, didn't look away, just watched, cataloguing the final moments of another human being, the way a naturalist might watch an animal breathe its last. 3 tragedies, 3 discoveries, 1 constant. Harding began to write. He noted the strange deaths of livestock near the Caldwell farm, neck breaks precise, wounds deliberate. He noted Timothy's fascination with the mechanics of dying, his polite but probing questions about anatomy, survival times, and pain, and Harding began to see the truth behind those pale blue eyes. Timothy Caldwell was not simply a child in a hard world. He was something the world had no name for, something science could not explain, something that, once you see it, makes you question how well you know the quiet, polite ones among us, because sometimes they're studying you back. By October of 1866, Dr. Samuel Harding had stopped believing in coincidence. The deaths, the livestock, the precision, the boy, every piece felt like it belonged to the same clockwork, each event a turning gear driven by something cold, calculating, and patient. Timothy Caldwell lived as though every hour had already been measured and assigned. At church he sat perfectly still, head bowed, hands folded, but his eyes, Harding swore they were scanning, not drifting, not daydreaming. Scanning, as if every cough, every limp, every sign of weakness in the congregation was being logged in some silent mental ledger. Neighbors had begun to speak quietly about the misfortunes near the Caldwell land. Mrs. Patterson's chickens, found with cleanly broken necks, no mess, no blood, no predator tracks. James Wickham's calves, strangled in ways no rope should have been able to tighten on its own. Robert Dunham's prize bull, dead in a ditch it should have been too cautious to cross. And in each case, at some point in the days before the incident, someone had seen Timothy walking the property line, always polite, always offering a wave, always watching. Harding began visiting the Caldwell farm under the guise of tending to Thomas and Sarah's various ailments. Timothy never left the room. He stood at a distance, silent, alert, eyes following Harding's hands as he worked. One afternoon, as Harding checked Thomas's lungs, Timothy asked, "How do you know if someone's really dead?" The question was delivered without morbid tone, without childlike fear, more like a student checking a fact. Harding gave a simple answer. The boy pressed further. "Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping, don't they? How long before you can be certain?" Harding lied, deliberately feeding him false markers for death, symptoms and timings that weren't accurate. Timothy didn't challenge him, didn't reave, or whether he knew the answers. But the doctor saw something flicker. Recognition, maybe even calculation, before the boy let the falsehood pass, as if storing it away, not for correction, but for use. It wasn't just death that fascinated him. It was process. Harding told a story about amputating a soldier's arm on the battlefield, how the man had lost consciousness before the cut. Timothy interrupted, polite as ever. Did they scream a lot, or were they too hurt to make noise? Harding had heard questions from curious children before. This was different. The boy wasn't picturing the horror to be frightened by it. He was dissecting the moment in his mind, mapping it, studying it. By November, Harding's journal entries had shifted from medical notes to something closer to surveillance reports. He wrote about the exact angle Timothy tilted his head when listening, the way he mirrored the posture and tone of whoever he spoke to, like a living reflection, the way his politeness disarmed suspicion. And always, the absence of play. In a community where even orphaned children still found moments to chase each other in the fields, Timothy's life was nothing but labor, observation, and something else, something no one could name yet. That was when Harding stopped thinking like a doctor and started thinking like a hunter. If Timothy was what he suspected, a predator disguised in the smallest, most unthreatening form, then waiting for proof might mean giving the boy another victim. He began asking neighbors for small details. When did you last see Timothy? Was he carrying anything? Did he speak to you first or wait for you to greet him? Patterns emerged. The boy often appeared just before an accident, always with an excuse for being there, always ready with a plausible explanation afterward. And if Harding was right, then Sedalia wasn't living through a string of tragedies. It was living in the center of someone's quiet, perfect experiment. Harding knew that predators, true predators, rarely reveal themselves without pressure. So he began to create it. Quietly, carefully. His first move was simple. Introduce variables. During one visit to the Caldwell farm, Harding forgot his medical bag in the barn. After tending to Sarah Caldwell's persistent cough, he made certain Timothy saw him leave it behind. Then he waited. When he returned later that evening, the bag was exactly where he had left it, but the arrangement inside was wrong. His instruments had been touched, repositioned, not rummaged through like a thief's work, placed back with the precision of someone who wanted them to appear untouched. The bone saw had been lifted from its slot and returned, angled half an inch off its original line. A scalpel had a faint smear across the handle, a mark Harding knew hadn't been there before, and his jar of chloroform. The stopper was not fully seated. Harding said nothing. He wanted to see if Timothy would reference it first. He didn't. He simply asked Harding whether chloroform could kill a person if they breathed too much of it. His voice was curious, polite, unthreatening. The second test was social. Harding arranged for a local boy, tough, quick-tempered, and easily provoked, to accidentally bump into Timothy at the general store and spill molasses on his shirt. Harding was nearby, watching for any flicker of temper, any break in the mask. Timothy did not react, not even a twitch. He apologized to the other boy for getting in his way and offered to help clean the mess. The other boy, thrown off balance by the kindness, mumbled and left, but Harding saw it just for a second when Timothy turned away. A tightening around the eyes. Not anger exactly, something colder, like a man noting a debt to be collected later. The third test was environmental. Harding lost a pair of sheep shears in the Pattersons' pasture, knowing Timothy often walked the fence there. The shears were intentionally left in the grass, their sharp edges catching the light. The next morning, Harding checked the spot. The shears were gone. 2 days later, Mrs. Patterson's rooster was found dead, its neck sheared through in one precise, impossibly clean cut. Too clean for teeth, too controlled for a struggling predator. The shears were never found. Now Harding was certain. Timothy was not simply a boy who attracted misfortune. He was a boy who cultivated it. But here was the problem. If he was right, the enemy he faced was wearing the skin of an 8-year-old, cloaked in politeness and community trust. Accuse him without proof, and Harding would be painted as a bitter old doctor seeing ghosts in the shadows. Do nothing, and more shadows would fall over Sedalia. He needed a trap that would force Timothy into a choice, one where innocence would have no advantage. And deep down, Harding knew, the real risk wasn't that Timothy would spring the trap. It was that Timothy would see it coming and turn it back on him. Harding decided the trap had to be public, something Timothy couldn't manipulate quietly, something that would force the boy's instinct to reveal itself in front of others. The opportunity came in late November, when the town prepared for the winter feed delivery. Wagons rolled through the square, heavy with sacks of grain, each drawn by teams of horses restless in the early frost. Harding volunteered to help by bringing his medical bag, just in case. But his real purpose was already in motion. He had spoken with Samuel Patterson the night before, convincing him to participate in a harmless deception. Patterson's job was simple. While unloading his wagon, he would accidentally drop a heavy sack of grain so it fell across Harding's boot, not enough to cause real harm, but enough to sell the moment as an injury. Harding positioned himself near the wagons when the Caldwell family arrived. Timothy stood beside his uncle, hands clasped behind his back, scanning the scene. Harding watched those pale eyes, calm, assessing, always assessing. Then it happened. Patterson gave a sudden shout, pretended to lose his grip, and the sack slammed down on Harding's foot. Harding staggered, let out a sharp cry, and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. The crowd reacted instantly. Sarah Caldwell gasped. Thomas stepped forward to help. And Timothy? He didn't move. Not at first. He just watched, not wide-eyed in shock like a normal child, not rushing forward like someone concerned. He studied Harding's face. Harding could feel it, the way prey must feel the still gaze of a predator in the dark. Then Timothy moved, quick and smooth, kneeling beside him. "Does it hurt a lot, Dr. Harding?" he asked, voice perfectly pitched with concern. "I could help you take your boot off." Harding nodded, playing along. Timothy's hands were gentle, steady, too steady. He unlaced the boot, but his fingers pressed, not on the ankle where the fake injury was, but on the side of Harding's foot where there were nerves that could spike pain if enough pressure was applied. It was subtle, deliberate, a test within the test. Harding winced, and Timothy's eyes flickered, not in sympathy, but in recognition, as if confirming data. Then Timothy stood, called for water, and stepped back into the crowd, faced the perfect picture of a helpful, concerned boy. The moment was over, but Harding knew he had learned what he needed. Timothy didn't just observe accidents, he interacted with them, controlled them, prodded at the boundaries to see how far things could go without anyone suspecting. That night, Harding wrote in his journal, "The boy is not content to watch suffering. He shapes it. Even in a staged event, he seeks the precise point where harm can be increased without revealing intent." And one more thing. During the commotion, Harding caught Timothy glancing at the horses harnessed to Patterson's wagon. It was a brief look, but the doctor had seen it before in soldiers on battlefields, the calculation of weight, force, and opportunity. Harding began to wonder if his trap hadn't just tested Timothy. It might have given him an idea. The morning after the staged accident, Harding found tracks in the frost near his back door. Boot prints. Small ones. Too small for any adult in town, but just the right size for an 8-year-old boy. The pattern was telling. The prints didn't approach directly. They circled first, paused at the woodshed, stopped beneath the window to his study, the one with the heavy curtains he had drawn the night before while writing in his journal. Harding felt the cold air deepen in his lungs as he realized Timothy was measuring his perimeter. For days afterward, the boy's presence shifted. No longer just incidental encounters in town or at the farm. Harding would feel it before he saw it. Eyes on the back of his neck as he checked patients, a glimpse of pale hair vanishing behind a shed, a polite greeting at a distance that arrived just a heartbeat too soon, as if Timothy had been standing there, waiting for Harding to notice him. The boy began to ask new kinds of questions, not about anatomy now, but about Harding's schedule. Do you go to all the farms in the same order each week? Do you walk home after dark sometimes? Does anyone else have the key to your surgery? Each question framed in innocence, each one tightening a net that Harding could feel, but not yet see. Harding stopped keeping his journals in the study. He locked them in a chest under his bed. Still, more than once he found the chest shifted slightly from its place, the latch caught on the first notch instead of the second. Nothing missing, but the message was clear. The boy knew where the truth was kept. One evening, as Harding left the Patterson farm, he caught sight of Timothy walking the fence line, hands in pockets, head bowed. The doctor slowed his horse. Timothy looked up, smiled politely, and called out, "Good night, doctor." The words were warm enough, but the pause after them wasn't. It was the kind of pause in which something unspoken waits, like a knife balanced in the palm. Harding realized then that his investigation had inverted. He was no longer the sole observer. The boy had begun his own study. That knowledge changed the air between them. Every conversation became a layered exchange. Harding feeding him half-truths, Timothy offering stories about chores or neighbors that were just a little too neat, a little too perfectly aligned to what Harding had been asking elsewhere. The next livestock death confirmed it. Mrs. Wickham's calf was found with its throat slit, not torn, not mauled, cut. Harding examined it in the barn with the door closed, certain only the Wickhams were present. Yet the next morning, Timothy approached him in town. "Sad about the Wickham calf," he said softly. "I heard you were there. No one else in town could have told him that. Not yet." Harding wrote that night. "The boy is adjusting to me, adapting. He has moved from concealment to countermeasure. This is no longer a study. It is a game. And the one who miscalculates first will lose." What Harding didn't know then was that Timothy had already set the next move in place, one that would pull the doctor into a situation no observer could control. It began with a knock on Harding's door just after midnight, 3 sharp raps, too precise to be urgent, too steady to be casual. When Harding opened it, he found Timothy standing alone in the frost, hands at his sides, breath misting in the cold. "Uncle Thomas fell," he said. The voice was calm but pitched low, almost urgent enough to be real. "He can't move his leg. Aunt Sarah told me to fetch you." Harding's mind clicked through possibilities. Either it was true, or the boy was engineering the moment. And if it was the latter, stepping into it meant stepping onto Timothy's stage. Still, to refuse would be to give the boy something else, the knowledge of what Harding feared. He dressed quickly, took his bag, and followed Timothy down the frozen road toward the Caldwell farm. The moon was thin, the fields black and still. The boy walked ahead, just close enough for Harding to hear his boots on the gravel, just far enough that his face stayed in shadow. Inside the farmhouse, Thomas sat in a chair by the fire, his face pale, his right leg was twisted awkwardly, swelling above the boot. Sarah stood behind him, wringing her hands. Harding set to work, cutting the boot away, feeling the bone, wrapping the joint. It was a bad break, but clean. Thomas explained that he'd slipped on ice in the barn and landed wrong. The story was plausible, but Harding's eyes moved past him to the corner of the room, where Timothy stood perfectly still, watching. Not his uncle's face, not Sarah's worry. Watching Harding's hands, every movement, every knot in the bandage. When Thomas was settled, Sarah went to make tea. Harding gathered his tools, but before he could leave, Timothy stepped closer. "If you broke your leg," the boy asked softly, "how long before you couldn't feel it anymore?" Harding answered evenly, "That depends on the break, and the blood flow." Timothy nodded, as if confirming something. Then he stepped aside, allowing Harding to pass, his pale eyes following him to the door. Halfway home, Harding stopped in the road. Something in the scene had been wrong, though he hadn't seen it clearly in the firelight. It came to him then, The barn floor where Thomas claimed to have slipped, Harding had crossed it earlier that day. Dry, no ice. If Timothy had staged this, the break was real, which meant the boy had caused it, which meant Harding had just treated a man for injuries inflicted by the child standing in the same room, calm, patient, learning. The thought was more than unsettling. It was clarifying. This was no longer about observation. It was about survival. Harding woke before dawn, not from sleep, but from the kind of shallow dozing that comes when the mind refuses to let the body rest. He moved through his rooms deliberately, checking locks, testing hinges, sliding his hand under the edge of the chest where his journals were hidden. The latch was secure this time, but he no longer believed that meant they were unread. He made a decision then. His study was no longer safe. That morning, under the pretense of needing to store medical supplies, Harding carried a satchel to the Patterson's smokehouse, where he tucked his journals into a sealed crate among jars of preserved beans. Few in town had reason to enter that building. Even fewer knew how to work the stubborn lock. Next came his rounds. Harding altered his route without warning, skipping certain farms, arriving at others hours earlier or later than usual. He wanted to see if Timothy could still, coincidentally, appear along his path. By the third day, Harding spotted him again, standing on the far side of a frozen creek, watching as Harding crossed the bridge. No wave this time, just a long, unbroken stare. That night, Harding began assembling what he called his quiet kit. Not weapons in the usual sense, but tools a doctor might have cause to carry: a length of clean linen, a roll of twine, a pair of forceps, a vial of laudanum carefully diluted to render an adult unconscious for several hours, all wrapped and hidden in the false bottom of his medical bag. If Timothy noticed, and Harding was certain he did, he gave no sign. The boy's presence in town remained polite, helpful, unremarkable, but the small anomalies began to stack again. A window left unlatched in Harding's back room, a patient mentioning in passing that Timothy had stopped by their farm, asking after the doctor. A single muddy boot print on Harding's porch, too small for a man, too large for the youngest children. Then came the final straw. One evening, Harding returned home to find a dead sparrow on his desk, perfectly intact. No wounds, no blood. Its neck was broken cleanly, and next to it, on a scrap of paper, was a single sentence in a child's neat handwriting. "I wanted to see if you could tell how it died." Harding burned the note in his stove, but as the paper curled and blackened, he realized something crucial. Timothy was no longer hiding his work from Harding. He was offering it, an invitation or a challenge. And Harding knew that meant only one thing: whatever came next would not be subtle. It happened on a Sunday. The church bell had just stopped ringing, and the townsfolk were spilling into the square, voices and footsteps muffled by the frost. Harding was halfway down the steps when he saw Timothy standing alone by the well, hands clasped behind his back. The boy didn't look up until Harding was close. Then, loud enough for the nearby families to hear, he said, "Doctor, will you tell everyone what you told me about how fast a person can bleed to death?" Conversations faltered, heads turned. Harding felt a ripple pass through the crowd, not alarm yet, but curiosity sharpened by the strangeness of the question. Harding smiled faintly, the way one might at a child's inappropriate curiosity. "That was about animals, Timothy. Remember?" But the boy tilted his head, pale hair catching the winter light. "No," he said. "You told me about people. How you'd tie a cord above the wound to slow it down. How long you'd have to work before—" He let the sentence trail off, eyes fixed on Harding. A murmur moved through the onlookers. Thomas Caldwell stepped forward, brow furrowed. "Tim, that's enough." But Timothy didn't look at his uncle. His gaze stayed locked on Harding. "You also said," he added, softer now, "that if someone was careful, they could make it last a very long time." The square was silent. Harding's pulse ticked in his ears. He could feel the shape of the trap. Either deny it outright, calling the boy a liar in front of his family, or laugh it off, confirming to Timothy that the message had landed exactly where it was aimed. Harding chose the middle ground. "We talk about many things, Timothy. Sometimes you remember them differently than I do." The boy smiled then, not wide, not warm, just a small curve of the mouth, enough to signal that he understood Harding's choice, enough to tell him the game had moved into the open. Sarah Caldwell ushered the boy away, muttering about stories getting out of hand. The crowd dispersed, conversation resuming in fits and starts. But Harding knew the seed had been planted, quiet doubts about the doctor's private conversations, about what he discussed with children. As the square emptied, Harding caught one last look from Timothy over his shoulder. It wasn't triumph exactly, more like the gleam of a chess player who's just moved a piece into a position from which it can't easily be removed. That night, Harding didn't sleep at all. He sat at his desk, lamp burning low, and made a list, not of Timothy's past actions, but of the possible ways the boy might try to end this game. By the bottom of the page, only two options remained. One of them ended with Harding leaving town. The other ended with someone dead. The trap began with a rumor. Harding first heard it from Mrs. Keating while tending her rheumatism. "They say the doctor's been calling on the Patterson girl after dark." She said it lightly, but her eyes were sharp, searching his face for a reaction. He laughed it off, but the moment he left her kitchen, he understood. That rumor had weight. It would spread fast in a small town, and it carried a particular cruelty. Miss Patterson was 16, shy, and easily flustered. Harding had treated her since she was a child. The suggestion alone was enough to stain him. By week's end, Harding noticed the change in the way people greeted him. Fewer lingering conversations, more glances exchanged after he passed. And Timothy, of course, appeared at the edge of every scene, sitting on a fence, walking a dog that wasn't his, loitering in the square, never close enough to speak, always close enough to watch. The second blow came when Sheriff Gorman visited Harding's surgery to clear up a misunderstanding. A small silver brooch, the kind young women wore pinned to their collars, had been found in Harding's back garden. Miss Patterson's father swore it belonged to her, missing since the prior week. Harding had no answer for how it got there. That night, Harding searched every inch of his house. In the cellar, behind a crate of empty bottles, he found more. A folded handkerchief with the Patterson family's laundry mark, and a tiny envelope containing 3 strands of pale hair. He didn't need to test them to know whose they were. It was elegant in its simplicity. Evidence in his home, a story already circulating, and a victim too young to question without looking guilty. Harding could see the future if he did nothing. A formal accusation, a trial, the ruin of his name whether he was convicted or not. The boy had cornered him. But Timothy had made one mistake. He had placed the last piece too soon. Harding now knew the full shape of the plan, and with that came his own countermeasure. He gathered the planted items, wrapped them carefully in oilcloth, and placed them in the false bottom of his medical bag, alongside the laudanum. If Timothy wanted to end this in the court of public opinion, Harding would force him into a different arena, one without witnesses, without rumor, without escape. 2 nights later, Harding left his lamp burning in the study, door unlocked. He waited in the dark of the kitchen, silent, patient, as the frost thickened on the window glass. When Timothy finally came, he wouldn't find a man on the defensive. He'd find a man ready to end the game. The first sound was the door's slow creak, then the faint pad of boots on the floorboards. Harding didn't move. From the kitchen shadows, he watched Timothy slip inside, small and precise, as if he'd rehearsed each step. The boy went straight to the study. Harding heard the rustle of curtains, the soft scrape of drawers. After a pause, the lamp dimmed, the boy shielding its glow to check something. Harding stepped into the doorway. "Looking for something, Timothy?" The boy didn't startle. He set the lamp back on the desk and faced him, hands empty. "You left the door open?" "Did I?" Harding said. His voice was calm, but his right hand stayed on the edge of the doorframe, blocking the way out. "What would you have done if I'd been asleep?" Timothy shrugged. "I'd have put things back where I found them." His eyes flicked briefly toward the medical bag on the floor by Harding's chair. The silence between them stretched. Harding let it. Finally he spoke. You've been clever, but you've made mistakes. The boy's mouth curved faintly. You're only saying that because you know you've already lost. Harding stepped closer, closing the gap to arm's length. The brooch, the hair, the handkerchief. You thought I'd panic, that I'd run, but all you did was tell me exactly how far you're willing to go. For the first time, Timothy's gaze flickered, just a flicker, toward the front door. Harding reached into the medical bag and brought out the oilcloth bundle, laying it on the desk between them. Yours to take back, or yours to explain. Either way, you don't leave here without deciding. The boy studied the bundle but didn't touch it. His voice was quiet now. If I take it, you'll say I was here. If I leave it, you'll say it proves I planted it. Exactly, Harding said. They stood in the lamplight, two predators in different skins, each waiting for the other to blink. Ow! Sighed. The wind pressed against the windows, the frost crackling in the eaves. Finally, Timothy smiled again, not the sly, private smile Harding knew, but something sharper, almost admiring. You're better at this than I thought. And you're still just a boy, Harding said. The boy's eyes narrowed. For now. He turned and walked past Harding without another word. The door closed softly behind him. Harding didn't move for a long time. He knew the game wasn't over. It had just entered its second act. The next morning, Harding awoke to the sound of knocking, not at his own door but far off, echoing across the street. He stepped to the window. Sheriff Gorman stood on the Caldwell porch, hat in hand, speaking to Sarah. Thomas sat in a chair near the doorway, his bad legs stretched out stiffly. Timothy was nowhere in sight. That absence was deliberate. Harding could feel it. By midday, the sheriff came to see him. "Doctor," Gorman said, settling heavily into the kitchen chair, "I'm here because there's talk again. Only this time it's not about the Patterson girl. Thomas Caldwell's tools are missing, expensive ones. Someone swears they saw you near the barn last night." Harding kept his expression neutral. "I was at home." "Funny thing," Gorman said. "That's what Timothy told me too. Only he said you were acting strange." It was a masterstroke. Timothy had removed himself from the scene while planting the seeds of suspicion from a safe distance. This was no longer just rumor-mongering. It was framing by increments, shifting the ground under Harding's feet until every denial sounded like a lie. That night, Harding sat with his journals in the smokehouse, turning pages, reviewing every note he'd made about the boy. The pattern was there now, clearer than ever, each escalation paired with a retreat, each retreat leaving behind a mess others would clean in ways that benefited Timothy. But there was something else, a question that gnawed at him. Why hadn't Timothy tried to end it last night when he had the chance? Harding thought about the boy's parting words. For now. It wasn't mercy, it was patience. Timothy didn't want Harding gone. Not yet. He wanted him here, trapped inside the tightening circle, until the end would serve as a demonstration. 3 nights later, Harding found the next move. He returned from tending a feverish infant to find his own back door AJ. On the kitchen table lay a single sheet of paper, carefully folded. Inside was a map, an exact floor plan of Harding's house, drawn in precise hand, every door and window marked. At the bottom, a note. "You've forgotten something important." The handwriting was the same neat script as the sparrow note. Harding sat very still, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a claim of ownership. The boy was telling him, "I know every way in and every way out," and that meant Harding's house was no longer his. He moved his sleeping cot into the surgery and began locking himself inside at night, oil lamp burning low beside the quiet kit. He changed his routes again, but this time left deliberate gaps, openings for Timothy to follow, to think he was closing in. Because Harding understood something now. The boy had been writing the rules of the game all along. If Harding wanted to win, he'd have to write new ones. And the first new rule was simple. Timothy wouldn't see the next move coming. Harding's new move began with the one thing Timothy seemed certain of, that Harding would never involve anyone else directly. The boy thrived on isolation. Every rumor, every piece of planted evidence worked because Harding faced it alone. So Harding decided to break that pattern. He started with Mrs. Ellsworth, the oldest midwife in the county and a woman with a memory like a ledger. He visited her under the pretense of bringing fresh laudanum, and while she poured tea, he spoke as if confiding a professional concern. "A patient's boy has been wandering into places he shouldn't," Harding said. "I'm worried he's collecting things, keepsakes." Mrs. Ellsworth, who had a weakness for other people's business, nodded gravely. "And whose boy is that?" Harding smiled faintly. "Not my place to say." He knew that answer would spread faster than a name. It would turn the entire town into a guessing machine, and Timothy into a suspect without anyone saying why. The second step was subtler. Harding began carrying a second medical bag, nearly identical to the first, but filled with nothing but junk, empty bottles, scraps of cloth, a few coins. He left this bag conspicuously unattended in the livery, the general store, the church vestry. Inevitably, the bag would be moved, sometimes just shifted a few inches, sometimes found with its latch open. Harding said nothing, but each time it happened, he made sure someone else noticed before he did. It was bait, and he knew Timothy couldn't resist. By the third week, the tension was visible. The boy was still watching him. Harding would catch the pale flicker of hair behind a shed, the sudden stillness of a figure at the far end of the street, but there was a sharpness to it now, a wariness. Timothy was used to choosing the moment of attack. Harding had taken that from him. Then, one night, Harding returned from a late delivery to find the decoy bag gone entirely. He didn't check the livery or the store. He simply went home, lit the lamp in his surgery, and waited. It took less than an hour. The back door eased open, and Timothy stepped inside, the bag dangling from his hand. He set it on the table without a word, but his eyes searched Harding's face, looking for anger, surprise, anything. Harding gave him nothing. Instead, he reached into the bag, pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper, and smoothed it on the table. Written in his own hand were the words, "Now you're carrying my things." Timothy's gaze lingered on the note. His mouth twitched, half a smile, half a snarl. Then he left, closing the door without a sound. Harding sat in the lamplight long after the boy was gone, the empty bag before him. This was no victory. Timothy wasn't finished. But the balance had shifted. For the first time, the boy had been forced to return something. The retaliation came 4 nights later. A sharp rapping on Harding's door woke him just past midnight. Sheriff Gorman stood there, breath clouding in the cold, his lantern swinging in one hand. "Doctor," he said grimly, "there's been trouble. You'd better come." They walked in silence down the frost-bitten street. Harding's pulse thudded with each step, not from fear of what he'd find, but from the certainty that this was Timothy's move. The air smelled of smoke before they even turned the corner. The Caldwell barn was burning. Orange light licked at the black sky, the roof already sagging in the middle. Townsfolk formed a line, passing buckets from the well, their shouts jagged with panic. Sarah Caldwell was weeping into her apron. Thomas, his face grey, tried to limp toward the blaze but was pulled back by 2 men. Harding's eyes found Timothy instantly. The boy stood apart from the others, his face a perfect mask of shock, but his hands were clasped neatly behind his back. And in the lamplight, Harding saw it, the faint smudge of soot along the boy's sleeve, too high for any bucket work. Gorman's voice cut in. "Thomas says he saw someone running from the barn before it caught. Says it looked like you." Harding turned slowly toward the sheriff. "And did he say that before or after Timothy spoke to him?" The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. "Doctor, you've been at the center of too many strange goings-on lately. You'd best keep to your own house until this is sorted." It was perfect. The fire would be red as rage, as revenge for the boy's earlier accusations, and even if Harding protested, the smoke in the air was already writing the story in the minds of everyone who saw him. The barn collapsed before dawn, a heap of glowing embers. Harding lingered at the edge of the crowd until most had gone. When he finally passed Timothy on the road, the boy didn't speak. He just looked up with a faint gleam in his eye, like someone listening to music only he could hear. That night, Harding returned to his surgery and sat at the desk. The rules had changed again. This was no longer a game of rumor and whispers. Timothy had crossed into destruction, something public, undeniable, and irreversible. The boy wasn't just dismantling Harding's reputation, he was building a case that could end in prison. Harding opened his journal and wrote a single line, "If this ends in fire, it will be on my terms." Then he began listing the places Timothy still visited alone, the schoolhouse loft, the disused granary, the little clearing by the river where the boy fed crows. He would need somewhere without witnesses, somewhere where the story could be written differently, this time by Harding's hand. Outside, the wind shifted, blowing the last of the barn smoke out over the fields. The next move would not be Timothy's. Harding's preparation began before sunrise. He had learned from Timothy's precision, every step of the plan must be quiet, deliberate, invisible, until the moment it mattered. He started at the surgery, clearing his shelves of certain medicines, tincture of belladonna, a small vial of chloral hydrate, and a syringe he polished until it gleamed. These he placed in his original medical bag, the real one, not the decoy. He wrapped the glass in soft cloth so it would make no sound if jostled. Next came the map. Not the boy's floor plan of Harding's home, but Harding's own drawing of the river clearing, the narrow path in, the fallen sycamore, the slope where shadows gathered even in daylight. Harding marked a single X where the ground dipped enough to swallow a man whole if the need arose. He folded it into his journal. By mid-morning, he was out on his rounds, speaking to patients with the same calm, steady voice he had always used. But at each house, he slipped in questions that seemed idle. "Seen Timothy lately?" Or, "Does the Caldwell boy still feed those crows by the river?" He noted the answers carefully. The picture that emerged was exactly what he wanted. Timothy still kept to his habits, and the clearing was still his sanctuary. In the afternoon, Harding visited the blacksmith under the pretense of needing new hinges for a cabinet. While the man worked, Harding examined the scrap bin and chose a length of chain and an old padlock, both rusted but still sound. He paid for them without explanation. That evening, Harding walked the path to the clearing alone. He moved slowly, memorizing every sound the woods made at that hour, the creak of ice in the river, the dry rattle of branches. He cleared a space behind the fallen sycamore, tamping down the frost-hardened earth. Into the hollow beneath, he slid the chain and lock, wrapped in oiled canvas. This was not a tray. Up he would set tonight. That would be too obvious, too soon after the barn fire. Timothy needed to believe the balance of power was still his. Back at home, Harding prepared the final part, the letter. He wrote it in a steady hand, unsigned, using only a single sentence. "Meet me at the place you think I don't know." He left the folded paper in the pocket of his decoy bag, then carried it openly through town the next morning, making sure to leave it unattended in the livery just long enough. That night, Harding dreamed of crows, black wings blotting out the stars, the sound of their beaks striking bone. He woke before dawn, lit the lamp, and read through his journal once more. Every entry led here, every rumor, every planted object, every fire had built to this point. The boy had made the rules. Now Harding would make the ending. The moon was thin that night, just a shard of silver over the black sweep of the river. Frost glittered on the path as Harding walked, his medical bag hanging from one hand, his breath clouding in the cold. He reached the clearing first. The fallen sycamore lay like a great rib across the ground, its bark white in the dim light. Harding stood beside it, the chain and lock hidden in the hollow where he had stashed them days ago. It was nearly an hour before Timothy appeared. The boy came without haste, as though he had merely wandered there by chance. He stopped just inside the tree line, the letter Harding had planted visible in his hand. "You wanted to meet," Timothy said. His voice was even, but his eyes flickered, curious, suspicious, alert. Harding nodded. "You've been clever. More clever than most grown men I've met." Timothy stepped closer, tilting his head like a bird considering its prey. "And you've been slower than I expected. I thought you'd break weeks ago." "I almost did," Harding admitted. "But I realized something. You don't want me gone. You want me here. You've been building to something, a final move." The boy smiled faintly. "Maybe I already made it." Harding took one slow step forward. The barn was sloppy. Fire is noisy, and noise gets noticed. You're careful, Timothy. That wasn't your real ending. Timothy's eyes narrowed. What is this then? You want me to confess? No, Harding said, his voice quiet. I want you to see what it feels like when the ground shifts under you. Before the boy could move, Harding's hand shot to the hollow in the sycamore. The chain came out in one smooth motion, the lock clinking softly. Timothy laughed, a short, sharp sound. You think you can hold me here? Not for long, Harding said. Just long enough. The boy took a step back, but the frost betrayed him. His boots slid on the slope, and Harding was on, him in 2 strides. The chain whipped around Timothy's wrists, the lock snapping shut. The boy struggled, but Harding had the advantage of weight and fury. When Timothy finally stilled, he was breathing hard, his eyes bright and unblinking. You'll regret this, he said. Harding crouched, meeting the boy's gaze. Maybe, but tonight, we're going to talk without your stories, without your little stage tricks. Just you, me, and the truth. Timothy tilted his head again, that strange avian motion. And if I don't give it? Harding straightened, looking out at the dark river. Then the crows will have something new to feed on. The boy's smile was slow and deliberate, as if he'd been waiting to hear those words. Finally, Timothy whispered, you're speaking my language. The wind along the river carried a low hiss, rattling the frozen reeds. Harding stood over Timothy, the chain links taut in his hands, the boy kneeling on the frost-bitten earth. You wanted the truth, Timothy said, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. You're not going to like it. Try me, Harding replied. The boy smiled faintly, almost with pity. This started before you even knew my name. My father died in your care. The fever took him, and you couldn't stop it. Harding's brow furrowed. That was last winter. He was beyond saving when I arrived. That's the story you told my mother, Timothy said, but she said you didn't come soon enough. You were tending some farmer's mare while my father was drowning in his own lungs. Harding's mind flashed back, snow driving sideways across the fields, the mare's foal half-born, the farmer begging. He had gone to Timothy's home that same night, but hours too late. He remembered the boy in the corner, pale as candle wax, staring at the sheet over the still body. You've built all this over that? Harding asked, incredulous. That, Timothy said, and the way you looked at me afterward, like I was just another patient you couldn't fix, something to be left behind. Harding felt the cold settling in his bones, but it wasn't from the wind. You wanted me ruined because I failed once. Timothy's smile sharpened. Not ruined, remade. I wanted you to feel the same helplessness I felt. I wanted to be the one standing over you while you scrambled to breathe. You could have come to me, Harding said, though even as he spoke, the words felt hollow. No, Timothy replied simply. Coming to you would have been asking for comfort. I don't want comfort. I want control. And you, he leaned forward slightly, the chain creaking as he moved. You're the only one in this place worth taking it from. For a long moment there, the only sound was the hiss of the river. Harding studied the boy's face, searching for some trace of the child who had stood in that cold room last winter. But there was only the fixed brightness in Timothy's eyes, the same brightness Harding had seen in men who played cards with their own lives as the stake. You've had your say, Harding said at last, and now I've had mine. Timothy tilted his head, curious. So what happens next? Harding glanced toward the dark water. That depends on how much you think your story's worth. The boy's expression didn't falter, but a flicker passed through his eyes. Interest, maybe even challenge. I think, Timothy said softly, it's worth more than my life. What about yours? Harding didn't answer. The chain between them was cold, but the air felt hotter, heavier, as if the clearing itself was holding its breath. Harding's hands ached from gripping the chain. The boy's wrists were thin beneath the iron, but Timothy's gaze never wavered, even with the frost gathering in his hair. You could end this now, Timothy said, almost helpfully. Push me into the river. It's deep enough here, even in winter. Harding's eyes followed the current, black, swirling, its surface flashing silver where the moonlight struck. It would be so simple. A moment of struggle, a single mistake in footing, and the town would whisper about an accident. But simple was never clean. "You think that's what I want?" Harding asked. "I think you don't know what you want," Timothy replied. "Not really. You've been playing defense for so long you've forgotten what victory looks like." Harding's jaw tightened. "Victory isn't putting a boy in the ground." "Then it's leaving him alive so he can ruin you again," Timothy said. "We both know I won't stop." The words struck harder than Harding expected, because they were true. If Timothy walked away from this clearing, the game would continue. More fires, more whispers, more planted objects to stain his name. The boy was a storm without an end. "Why me?" Harding asked finally. "You could have picked anyone." Timothy's smile was slow and deliberate. "Because you're the only one worth beating. The others would just fold. You fight back. You make it interesting." Harding felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the cold. In Timothy's eyes, this wasn't hatred. It was a kind of intimacy, a bond forged in battles that no one else even knew they were fighting. The river hissed, and the frost crept higher on the grass. Harding loosened his grip on the chain just slightly. "If I let you go, you'll keep coming." "Yes," Timothy said without hesitation. "And if I don't?" Harding's eyes shifted toward the water. Timothy tilted his head, bird-like. "Then you'll ever know what I might have done next." They stared at each other for a long time. Doctor and boy, predator and prey, though neither role fit cleanly anymore. Harding took a step back. The chain slackened. "Go," he said. Timothy blinked, as if the command confused him. "Just like that?" "Not just like that," Harding said. "You win this round, but you don't win the last one." The boy stood slowly, the frost crunching under his boots. Harding unlocked the chain, the metal clicking in the stillness. Timothy rubbed his wrists, then met Harding's eyes one final time. "You're smarter than I thought," Timothy said. "This will be fun." And then he was gone, slipping into the trees as if the forest itself swallowed him. Harding remained in the clearing, the chain heavy in his hands, the river whispering at his back. He knew he had not ended anything. He had only set the stage for something far worse. Timothy didn't take the road back to town. He cut through the trees, his boots skimming over frost-slick roots, his breath low and controlled. The cold sharpened him. Every step away from the river clearing felt like the tightening of a bowstring. He had expected Harding to try drowning him. He had prepared for it. Stones in his pockets, a hidden blade in his boot, even the old trick of going limp to slip free of a grip. But Harding had done something more dangerous than killing him. He had let him go. By the time Timothy reached the back of the Miller farm, the moon was higher. The frost deepened to a brittle crust that cracked underfoot. The barn stood dark. The Millers slept early in winter, which suited him fine. He pried a loose board from the barn wall and slipped inside. The air smelled of old hay and cold iron. In the corner, a wooden crate sat under a dustcloth. He knew what was in it before he pulled the cover back. Tools, coiled rope, an oil lantern half full. The rope would be useful. He cut 3 lengths, knotting each in the way his father had shown him. Knots that would tighten under strain, knots that could be hidden until they mattered. These he wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. His next stop was the edge of the Weathers property. They kept pigeons in a loft there, and Timothy had been feeding them crumbs for months. Tonight, he left something different. A scrap of cloth cut from Harding's old medical satchel, stolen weeks ago. The pigeons would pick it apart, scatter the pieces across the fields, and someone would find them. They always did. By dawn, whispers would start. Why was Harding's bag in such a place? Why did pieces of it show up so far from his rounds? But this was just the opening move. Near the old quarry, Timothy buried the burlap-wrapped ropes under a flat stone. In spring, when the ground softened, he would retrieve them. Harding had given him space to plan, and he intended to make use of every hour. As he worked, he thought about the look on Harding's face in the clearing, not fear, not victory, but calculation. It was the same look Timothy had seen in gamblers before they laid down their last card. That meant Harding was still in the game. Timothy liked that. By the time he returned to his mother's house, the sky was paling, the frost turning to dew. He slipped inside through the kitchen door and climbed the stairs without a sound. From his window, he could just see the faint line of the river in the distance. Somewhere out there, Harding was still awake, still thinking about him. The boy smiled to himself. The next round would be his. Harding didn't sleep. After Timothy vanished into the trees, he remained in the clearing for nearly an hour, letting the cold gnaw at him until his fingers were too stiff to bend. It kept his mind sharp. He turned the chain over in his hands like a worry bead, thinking about the boy's eyes. Bright, steady, too old for his face. By the time he walked back to town, the eastern sky was paling. He took the side streets, avoiding the main square, moving through the places where the snow stayed unbroken. But even in the quiet, something prickled at him, a sense that the game had already resumed before he'd reached his door. At his cottage, Harding lit the stove and poured water from the kettle into a chipped basin. The mirror above it showed a face he barely recognized, beard rough, eyes shadowed, skin drawn tight from cold and worry. He splashed water on his cheeks and tried to think like Timothy. The boy wouldn't strike the same way twice. Fires and planted objects were too obvious now. No, this round would be subtler, smaller moves that looked like accidents, harmless until they were not. He didn't have to wait long for the first sign. Just after noon, Mrs. Weatherby from the edge of town came rapping on his door. She was wrapped in her heavy shawl, her breath puffing clouds. "Doctor, you'll want to hear this," she said. "Miller's found something queer this morning, bits of cloth in their pigeon loft. Recognized it as part of that old satchel you used to carry. Said they'd seen you near their place 2 nights back." Harding's stomach sank. He hadn't been near the Miller property in weeks. "What color?" he asked. "Brown, with that frayed strap you've never fixed," she said. "Looked just like yours. Everyone knows that bag." Harding forced a nod, keeping his voice even. "Probably some old scrap the birds dragged in, but thank you for letting me know." She left, but the damage was already done. It wasn't about the cloth. It was about the whisper of doubt that would travel faster than truth. Harding could almost hear Timothy's voice. "It's not the fire that ruins you. It's the smoke that stays in the air." By mid-afternoon, he heard 2 more small things. A farmer mentioning that Harding's mare had been seen wandering near the quarry, a lie, and someone at the tavern muttering about rope found by the Weathers' gate, also a lie. The boy was weaving threads, thin enough to ignore alone, but strong enough when braided together. Harding sat in his study as dusk fell, a single candle throwing shadows across the floor. He pictured Timothy moving through the night, planting seeds that would sprout in weeks or months. If Harding tried to pull them up now, people would think him paranoid. The boy knew it. For the first time, Harding considered leaving, not out of fear for his life. Timothy was too deliberate for that, but because the slow erosion of his name might be worse than any physical harm. Yet the thought curdled quickly. Leaving would mean Timothy won, and he had not spent his life in this town, tending to its sick and burying its dead, just to be chased off by a boy with a taste for games. Harding's eyes went to the chain on the table. It was cold, coiled like a sleeping snake. He reached out and set it in the center of the desk. If Timothy wanted the next round, he would get it, but Harding intended to choose the ground they fought on. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of pigeons from the Miller loft. Harding allowed himself a thin smile. The boy thought he was clever, but there were ways to catch a bird without a net. The trick was to let it believe it was free. Harding waited 3 days before moving. It wasn't easy. Every hour that passed, he heard new scraps of talk. Someone claiming he'd been seen near the quarry at night, another saying rope had gone missing from the Miller barn. Timothy's net was tightening, but Harding forced himself to stay still. The boy wanted him rattled. Instead, Harding made himself invisible. On the 4th night, under a moon thin as a blade, Harding took the chain and left his cottage. He didn't go toward the Miller property or the Weathers' gate. He went to the one place he knew Timothy would come without invitation, the clearing by the river. He worked quietly, stringing the chain low between two trees and covering it with a scatter of leaves. The moonlight turned the frost to silver, hiding the subtle depression in the earth where he'd dug a shallow pit. Inside, he set a burlap sack filled with dried thistle heads, the kind that splintered into 1,000 needles when touched. Painful, but not deadly. The trap wasn't to kill, it was to hold. By dawn, Harding had returned home and sent out his first message, a simple note, folded twice, left at the weathered post in the center of town where boys often lingered. The note read, "I know where the rest of the bag is. Come alone." No name, no signature, but Timothy would recognize the handwriting. Harding made sure of that. He didn't have to wait long. That night, the sound of careful footsteps came along the riverbank. Harding crouched in the shadows, heart steady, watching the boy's outline slip through the trees. Timothy moved like a cat, silent, scanning the ground ahead, until he reached the edge of the clearing. His eyes darted to the pit, disguised under its scatter of leaves. He stepped forward, testing the earth with his boot. That was when the chain caught him at the ankles. There was a sharp yelp, followed by the crash of his body into the pit. Thistle needles burst upward in a dry hiss, catching in his coat, his hair, his skin. He struggled, but the chain twisted tighter, forcing him to the ground. Harding stepped from the shadows, his breath clouding in the cold air. "You're quick," he said, "but not quicker than me." Timothy stopped thrashing and looked up, eyes glinting. "So this is it? You trap me, drag me back, tell the town I'm the villain?" Harding shook his head. "No, I don't need the town to believe me. I just need you to believe I'm done playing your game." He knelt, tightening the chain once more, not enough to cut circulation, but enough to hold. "You can walk away from this tonight, but if you come for me again, Timothy, if I so much as hear a whisper of my name in your mouth, you'll wish I'd thrown you in that river." The boy's expression didn't change, but Harding saw it, the smallest flicker of doubt. "I'm not afraid of you," Timothy said. "Good," Harding replied. "Fear wears off. Respect doesn't." He loosened the chain, letting the boy stand. Timothy brushed thistle needles from his sleeves, each movement slow, deliberate. Then he stepped past Harding without another word and disappeared into the trees. Harding stayed in the clearing until the sound of footsteps faded completely. Only then did he pull up the chain and carry it home, the metal heavy and familiar in his hands. The game wasn't over. It never would be, not with someone like Timothy. But tonight, Harding had chosen the ground and held it. Sometimes in battles that last a lifetime, that's enough. In